SuperGym, Get Fit or Die Trying, by M. Frappier. Copyright 2011. Audio copyright Frapp Media, 2021. For Thor the Destroyer. Chapter 1. There was life before the SuperGyms, but very few people seem to remember. Things are different now. Life is made up of sweat and steel, hunger pains and spandex. It's the new normal. Calorie counting is our only religion. Hanging above every reception desk in every SuperGym in the city is a poster. The words, "Who needs a god when you can become one?" are plastered all over pictures of the elite, the desirable, the SuperGym trainers. They are the ideal, tanned, toned, and attractive. They are what everyone is trying to become, and we worship them. The trainers are cruel. It's part of the program. Join a SuperGym, get assigned to a beautiful deity, and allow them to pummel you into jelly. You love them for it. You come back for more. Every time. Most of the trainers have numerous clients. Each gets their own personal hour of torture. More if they've binged or refused to take their punishment with a smile. There was only one exception. Tessa. Tessa was only sort of pretty, but she made up for it with her sheer enjoyment of pain. She could take a client for an hour and leave them a sniveling, cringing ball of sweat and tears. She was one of the SuperGym's top trainers, but not quite number one. She was not quite perfect. Not quite the ideal. She still had something to prove. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a severe ponytail, and she sported neon green short shorts and a purple sports bra, the standard uniform of the female trainers. Somehow Tessa wore it like battle armor. She was short and petite, but clients quaked in fear when they saw her coming. Tessa had only one client, a special case. An impossible case, maybe, but Tessa didn't believe in impossible. There was only the subservient ones, and the ones yet to be broken. She didn't think it would take long. It rarely did. This one didn't look like much. Mousy, dirt-colored hair, a large belly, an ample bosom, and short, squat legs. Other trainers had failed with Maggie. She was a junk food junkie, yet she always tried her best and did what they asked her. Her body simply refused to drop weight. She was a problem, sure, but not impossible. Tessa could break anyone. Maggie was dying. Her chest heaved, her lungs burned. There was a piercing pain in her neck and another under her ribs. Her feet pounded out a steady rhythm on the treadmill, while her labored breathing provided a harsh melody line. Maggie had once dreamed of being a musician. Of course, it had only ever been a dream. There was no music anymore. There were thumping electronic sounds that were engineered to produce a maximum heart rate, but that wasn't music. Maggie only had a vague memory of it from her childhood. Before Benjamin Pratt took over Famecili and built his first SuperGym. Music, art, and books were some of the first things he banned. Tessa perched on the front of the treadmill like a tiny, muscular gargoyle. Her sharp eyes were focused intently on the screen, her brow furrowed. She frowned. Something about the flashing red lights was making her angry. "Faster," she yelled, and punched the buttons below the screen savagely. The machine beeped, and the belt whirred. Maggie was falling behind. Her heels came dangerously close to the edge. Tessa screeched like a banshee and jumped down from her perch. "Don't you dare fall off!" Maggie grabbed the handles as her foot slipped, and she managed to stay on the speeding belt. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. It drowned out the thunderous staccato of hundreds of feet pounding the treadmills that filled the massive room. Her feet flew. She couldn't keep it up. The truth dawned on her just before her right leg gave out. She tried to quicken her pace, but it was too late. Her hands flew to the handles of the treadmill. Tessa hissed. Maggie clung to the machine. Her arms trembled. She knew what came next. "Hands off." Tessa was screaming in her face, but Maggie barely noticed. She willed her legs to move faster, but they couldn't. Tessa was tearing at her fingers, pulling them back so far they cracked. Maggie let go. She managed 2 more strides. On the third, her leg buckled under her and hit the belt. Pain and heat exploded as the skin was burned from her shins. She narrowly missed hitting her chin as she tumbled in a graceless backward somersault off the machine. She crashed into the treadmill behind her. Benjamin Pratt's right-hand man, Thor, was training a client on that machine. He focused his pale blue eyes on her for just a moment, and Maggie felt her stomach turn over. Even Tessa's face had gone from scarlet to pale. Thor didn't speak. He rarely did. He gave Tessa a look that would have shriveled even the toughest trainer. He stepped over Maggie and punched the buttons on his client's treadmill. The client was bald but muscular, strong. His face was already red and he was panting. As the machine came to life, he took a brief moment to glare at Maggie before focusing again on an invisible horizon. Tessa grabbed Maggie's shirt and pulled her up. Her legs were still wobbly and weak. Blood trickled down from the raw patches on her shins. Tessa watched her struggle. Maggie could see the rage that was welling up in her tiny trainer. She was in for it now. Tessa pulled out her timer and smiled. It made her look younger, almost sweet. But Maggie knew that grin. Burpees for an hour. We'll get that disgusting fat off you yet. Thor was still watching them. Both women knew it without glancing over. His presence was enormous. It filled the cardio room. Tessa had to show him what she could do. She could not fail in front of the SuperGym's head trainer. She grabbed Maggie's frizzy ponytail and yanked her across the room to an open mat. She leaned down close. Her breath was like fire on Maggie's neck. You're going to learn very quickly that I never fail. You're mine now, and you will not fail. Now get moving. You've got another hour of weights after this. She clicked a button on the timer, and it beeped. Maggie remained panting on her hands and knees. She tried to stand, but she couldn't. Lights exploded behind Maggie's eyes as Tessa brought her sneaker up into her ribcage. Something cracked. The pain was even worse. Another kick. Go ahead. Stay down there. I can do this all night. Maggie tried to ignore the pain. Her vision was coming back, but it was blurred at the edges by treacherous tears. She sniffed back a sob as she jumped her feet back into a push-up position. Tessa was laughing. Are you crying? You know my policy. Crying gets you more pain. Haven't you had enough for one day? Maggie didn't answer. She couldn't. She was biting her lips so hard she could taste her own blood. It was the only way to stop the screams that were building inside her. She completed her burpee. Tessa looked disappointed. Then she sneered at Maggie. 1 down, 1,000,000 to go. I really hate her. Maggie tried to ignore the voice, but she knew it was pointless. The voice was always there. It was a part of her, yet somehow it seemed separate from her own thoughts. It hadn't always been so strong. It first started around the time of her father's death, and had been little more than a whisper. Easy to ignore. Just stop. It hurts too much. What's she going to do, kill you? Shut up, other Maggie. Maggie knew that she couldn't refuse. Tessa would hurt her. She might kill her. Or maybe Thor would. Or Benjamin Pratt. They were all interested in her, and they each wanted to be the first to break her. Chapter 2. Weigh-in day. The absolute worst day of the week. Days no longer carried the old names. There was leg day, or chest and back day, or cardio day. It was an endless cycle of workouts that would go on for eternity. Nothing ever changed. But weigh-in day was the day every client feared the most. They were on display in front of the entire gym. Every client was forced to step onto the massive glowing scale and have their successes and more often failures, displayed for all to see. If they lost weight, they were allowed to participate in the loser's yoga class, and were even given a few hours to relax at the end of the day. If clients gained, they were at the mercy of their trainers, and Benjamin Pratt. Benjamin Pratt was a fit, balding man in his 50s. His skin was tight and brown and shiny like leather. His dark hair was shaved close to his head and showed off the tattooed eyes on the back of his skull. The message was pretty clear. Mr. Pratt oversaw the weigh-ins at every SuperGym and kept a close eye on his problem clients. Maggie was his most recent obsession. He had tried every imaginable combination of diet, exercise, mental abuse, and torture, but she would not break. She was quietly defiant while still doing everything that was asked of her. She exhausted him, and he found her fascinating. He assigned Maggie to Tessa as a last-ditch effort. Most clients would have been shipped off to fat camp after a few gains, but Maggie was different. She was special. He needed to break her. Her father had fought against the rise of the SuperGyms, and that could not be forgotten. He would make Maggie succeed, or she would die trying. Tessa didn't want Maggie as her only client. She enjoyed working with different people and finding new ways to turn them into whimpering piles of jelly. She had learned to use them against each other and had many spies. Maggie didn't seem to have any friends, and she trained with a cool, detached look on her face that made Tessa want to jump on the girl and tear her eyes out. She wasn't used to such open defiance. The line shuffled forward as another blonde stepped onto the scale. 5 more clients to go. Then it would be Maggie's turn. She pinched the thick roll of flesh on her waist. It didn't look any smaller. It actually looked bigger. Tessa was going to be pissed. The blonde lost 3 pounds. Not great. Her head dropped and she shuffled off the scale. Her trainer shook her head and made a note on her chart. She snapped the file shut and pushed her next client forward. Tessa appeared at Maggie's side. Her ponytail bounced rapidly. She never actually stopped moving. Even standing still, her body vibrated. She balanced on her toes, ready to sprint away at any moment. "How are you feeling today? Any lighter? I'm still waiting for that big number." "And I'm waiting for you to die." "I think I've lost a little this week." Tessa looked angry, but it didn't last long. Her smile blinked back on. Trainers were always upbeat and positive at public gatherings. Tessa's bright smile stopped at her teeth. Her dark eyes were full of hate. She gave Maggie a push. "Your turn. Don't disappoint me." The scale was a massive purple and green monstrosity. It loomed over her, waiting to pronounce her fate. The lines of clients clad in purple and green spandex stretched across the massive gym and spilled out into the hallway. Maggie saw Benjamin Pratt approach Tessa. He said something, and her smile faded and blinked back on. The numbers flashed over Maggie's head. Beep, 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 beep. Just do it already. The numbers went from green to red. Sad, woeful music played. Tessa's bright smile blinked. Off, on. The sound that came out of her mouth was a strangled, primal noise. She threw her notebook on the ground and stomped on it. "A pound? You gained a pound? What is wrong with you?" Tessa let out another strangled scream, grabbed her notebook and stormed up the stairs. Her hand clamped down on Maggie's arm. Her nails dug into the soft flesh. Her face was purple with rage. She smacked Maggie on the back of the head and dragged her down the stairs and past the waiting clients. They kept their eyes trained on the floor. No one dared to look at her. Tessa crashed through the door and pushed Maggie into the weight room. She pointed one trembling finger at a nearby weight bench. "Get lifting, fatty." She loaded the bar with more weight than usual. Maggie knew she was in trouble. Tessa leaned over her. Her face was inches from Maggie's, and little droplets of spit flew from her mouth as she spoke. "I said lift, fatty." Maggie tried. She groaned and struggled under the weight. The bar wobbled, and the weights clanged. Tessa watched with her hands on her hips. Her smile was back, but she was still angry. You know you'd be pretty if you just lost the weight. If you put in any effort at all, it would just fall off you. No more nasty fat. Don't you want that? Don't you want to be attractive? No. Maggie herself couldn't answer. The bar was pressing down on her chest. The air was being squeezed from her lungs. Her head ached. Pressure was building behind her eyes, and panic washed over her. She struggled feebly against the bar until Tessa sighed and lifted it off. You really are pathetic, you know that? She brushed a hair out of her face with an irritated swipe of her hand. Maggie choked and gasped for breath. I'm trying. No, you're not. You do the absolute minimum, and you don't follow your diet plan at all. I tried. I hate broccoli. Tessa shook her head and frowned. Don't lie to me. I know where you go at night. My spies are everywhere. A sudden wave of cold washed over Maggie. She nervously chewed her lower lip. Why would you do that? It's standard protocol. You haven't lost weight in months. Tessa shook her head sadly. You had such a promising start, too. The weight should be falling off you. You're on the gold plan. It's the junkies, Maggie. You've got to stop. I can't stop. They're so gross. Nothing but sugar and fat and calories. And who knows how many chemicals. How can you do that to your body? They make me feel good. Feeling good is not part of the plan. Tessa pulled a long silver mirror from beneath the weight bench. There were mirrors hidden all over the gym. The trainers used them as a motivational tool. She held it up. Look at yourself. Really look. Look at how disgusting you are. You don't deserve to feel good. Maggie looked at her reflection. Her belly hung over the waistband of the impossibly tiny shorts that everyone was required to wear. Her butt was lumpy, and the little shorts didn't cover it all. Bluish-white bulges of fat poked out above her thighs. Fat hung off her arms in wobbly wings and erupted over the sides of her too-tight sports bra. There was a slight doughy pooch under her chin. Tessa might actually have a point. Maggie shook her head slightly. Other Maggie could be a real bitch. Tessa was looking at the scar on Maggie's forearm. Her hand darted out and snatched the back of Maggie's shorts. Hey! You already took out the new chip? Come on, Maggie, this has to stop. The tracker helps me tailor a plan to meet your specific needs. You're sabotaging your progress. Yeah, I've heard the sales pitch before. Tessa slapped her. Hard. Tears filled Maggie's eyes and threatened to spill down her cheeks. Maybe you should listen this time. How did you find it? It hadn't been difficult. Maggie knew as soon as she woke up that they'd drugged her. Her head throbbed in that special way that she knew so well. It hadn't taken long to find the tiny pinprick. She pressed on her skin until the transmitter was just below the surface. She'd stolen Tessa's knife a day before and used it to dig out the little metal ball. It hurt like hell, and there was blood everywhere. Maggie was pissed that Tessa had discovered her handiwork so quickly. Mr. Pratt doesn't like it when clients remove their hardware. One strike, and they're shipped off to fat camp. Why haven't I been sent there? This must be my third or fourth strike at least. Tessa didn't answer immediately. She flopped down on a nearby bench and adjusted her ponytail. When she looked at Maggie, her eyes were softer. Her smile was gone, and her skin sagged just a little. Maggie noticed the dark circles under her eyes. You're special, Maggie. Mr. Pratt wants you to succeed, and that means I do too. I think I'd rather go to fat camp. Do they have arts and crafts? It's not funny. I really am trying to help you, Maggie. I wish you understood the game a little better. Just follow the rules, okay? Maggie didn't answer. Tessa sighed and crossed her arms. Her foot tapped impatiently. She really couldn't stop moving, not even for a second. They stared at each other for a long time. A strand of hair had come loose from Tessa's tight ponytail. It stood up on the top of her head. Maggie stifled a laugh, but she couldn't contain it. Her shoulders shook with the effort. Tessa's eyes narrowed. Her mouth tightened into a hard line. Tessa hated laughter. She threw her hands up and growled. "You're impossible. Fine. Don't follow the rules. I'll get assigned to a new group of fatties and you'll just be given to Thor. He's your last chance, you know. If the almighty Thor can't fix you, no one can, right? And what then? When you've done the impossible and failed Thor's program, do you know what comes next? Fat camp. Trust me, you do not want to go there. It can't be any worse than this. Think about what you really want, Maggie. I can't do it for you. Come on, you've got a few more hours on the treadmill. You can think about it while you sweat." She walked away without another word. Maggie dropped the barbell on the floor. It clanged loudly, but Tessa didn't acknowledge her. Barbell level complete. Back to mindless treadmill running. Her feet pounded out a steady rhythm, and the treadmill shuddered under the force of her effort. Her eyes were stinging from the sweat that poured in a continuous stream down her face. Droplets flew off her hair and dripped from her nose as she ran. Sweat pooled in her sneakers and made them squish with every step. Maggie hated the sound. Tessa glanced impatiently at her watch and wrote something on the tiny black tablet that never left her side. She looked annoyed. Good, I'm glad she's annoyed. I hate this. Tessa climbed onto the treadmill with the grace of a cat. Is this too easy for you, princess? Here, let me give you a challenge. Maggie's feet flew. Her chest ached. Her heart was definitely going to explode. This was the end. She was going to die on a treadmill, the worst invention in the history of man. Tessa was laughing and clapping her hands. Maggie wanted to hit her. Her hands tingled with anticipation. Tessa punched the buttons again. The belt whirred faster and faster. Maggie's feet became entangled. She tripped. Her arm flew out and made contact with Tessa's jaw. Tessa's head snapped back, and Maggie saw her wide-eyed expression of surprise. She fell. It was over in an instant, but it felt like hours. Maggie turned off the treadmill and stepped carefully to the side. Everything was happening in slow motion. She leaned heavily on the machine and tried to catch her breath. Tessa was still lying on the floor. The other trainers crowded around her. Maggie only got a glimpse, but it was enough. Tessa lay in a growing pool of dark blood. Maggie turned away and was suddenly and violently sick. Someone grabbed her arm and dragged her away from the commotion. A towel was shoved in her face. Clean yourself up and get a grip. Thor. He was the SuperGym's sexiest trainer. He was also the most sadistic and cruel. Every client in Famecili feared being assigned to him, and he was given all of Benjamin Pratt's special cases. Except for you. If she's dead, it's your fault. He looked at her with his ice-blue eyes. His expression was cold and emotionless. Maggie's stomach flipped over. She was going to be sick again. He was right. Tessa was dead, and it was her fault. It wasn't the first time this had happened. Chapter 3. Maggie's dad had always been her hero. Her mother never really loved her. She did nothing to hide her wish for a prettier daughter, and was constantly reminding Maggie of her many shortcomings. Her mother was thin and beautiful. She ate very little and subsisted on SuperGym shakes and vitamins. She did her hour of training, but her effort was minimal. She just naturally fit the ideal and could never really understand the struggle. Maggie was soft and round like her dad. When she was little, she had enjoyed reading and watching the old shows that her dad loved. They were antiquated stories about space and time travel. Maggie had often wished that she could be beamed somewhere far, far away from the city, and her mother, and the SuperGyms. She was only 9 when Benjamin Pratt took over Famecili. It didn't take long for his SuperGyms to dominate the skyline. He passed laws that banished junk food and required anyone with a fat rating of 2 or higher to exercise for a minimum of 4 hours a day. No one tried to stop him. The beautiful people were quietly happy that they no longer had to look at the fatties, and the fatties were too embarrassed and scared to speak out against him. Anyone who did dare to protest soon went missing. Maggie's father was one of the first to disappear. The last uprising had been a little more than 6 months ago, the final purge. The Health at Any Size coalition had grown for several years after Benjamin Pratt took over Famecili. The fatties joined together to fight for acceptance and respect in the face of the growing SuperGym craze. Maggie considered joining them many times over the years. She was young, but they would have taken her. They might have even tried to protect her. But in the end, she couldn't do it. She was not proud of her fat. Her body was an embarrassment, and she did not want to draw attention to her flab. It was a good decision. Every member of the organization was eventually hunted down and killed. Mr. Pratt declared they were a plague on Famecili. He wanted them exterminated like bugs. So they were wiped out of existence. Maybe there were others, but if so, they had abandoned their cause and bought a SuperGym membership. Everyone did if they wanted to survive. The final purge was the worst. Some of the strongest members were the last to be rounded up. They had gone into hiding, and it took Mr. Pratt's goons a long time to find them. The day they were captured, Maggie felt her last ounce of hope die. They bound the fatties' hands and feet, and several of the strongest SuperGym trainers dragged them through the streets. Their screams filled the air as everyone gathered in the park to watch the final executions. The hangings had been terrible, but this was worse. They were trussed up in front of everyone and hung like pigs over hot coals. Some cried, some begged for leniency. The strongest of them remained silent. They watched the growing crowd with looks of disdain, but this was a mistake. Benjamin Pratt had to make an example of them. His trainers killed the criers first. They were the lucky ones. A quick slash across their throats and it was over. The silent ones suffered the most. Mr. Pratt gave a speech before the executions. He listed their numerous offenses and whipped the crowd into a frenzy. Maggie joined in. Everyone did. It wasn't safe to stand out from the group. She screamed and stamped her feet. She shook her fists in the air. Mr. Pratt walked out into the crowd and selected 3 people. Maggie was the last one chosen. Her knees were weak as she followed him to the stage. She was certain it was her time to die. Instead, he handed her a knife. She didn't want to do it, but she didn't have a choice. She clutched the handle of the knife and tried to slow her racing heart. Maggie put the blade to the man's throat, but Mr. Pratt stopped her hand. They were not going to die that day. Not by her hand, anyway. For one very brief moment, Maggie was relieved. The trainers surrounded her. They crossed their arms over their chests and formed a tight circle around her and the fatty. They forced her to strip the man, first of his clothing, and then of his flesh. She gagged as she carved the fat from his body. He was a large man, and he held out for as long as he could. Then he began to scream. He cried and fought against the restraints while she cut. Blood spilled everywhere. It splashed over her shoes and splattered her legs. The crowd was cheering and screaming wildly, like animals. Maggie was crying so hard she could barely see. She threw up, but the trainers would not let her stop. She kept cutting until the man was unrecognizable. Mr. Pratt parted the wall of muscle and examined her work. A small smile crept onto his lips, and he gave her a slight nod. He slashed the man's throat with one quick motion. Maggie screamed and buried her face in her blood-soaked hands. She hadn't slept for a year afterward. Chapter 4. They were changing the fat rating system again. Every time the system changed, the numbers were harder to achieve. Maggie had an FR of 4. The new system would make it a 7. It was far beyond the acceptable range, but that was nothing new. She had never had an acceptable fat rating. No one cared at first. Benjamin Pratt only took an interest in her when her mother was promoted to trainer. As a trainer, her mother could no longer be seen with Maggie in public. Mr. Pratt moved Maggie into a small apartment with a girl named Monica and paid Tessa to train her for 2 hours every day. This was in addition, of course, to the 4 hours that clients with her FR were required to do daily. Mr. Pratt made Maggie an office assistant at the newest SuperGym. Her life was under constant scrutiny. She couldn't escape the watchful eyes of the trainers, but it made no difference. Her weight refused to budge. It made Mr. Pratt angry, but he usually took his anger out on Tessa. He had slapped Tessa repeatedly during a heated argument the previous week. That day, Maggie had stepped on the scale and gained 6 pounds. Thor finished Maggie's workout that day. It was her first time training with him, and she never wanted to work with him again. His style was completely different. He didn't yell like Tessa and the other trainers. He didn't need to. His sheer size was enough to intimidate, and his pale eyes gave him a sinister look. Maggie was briefly attracted to him, until he threw a heavy dumbbell at her face. Today, he merely pointed to the squat rack. She eyed the bar warily. The plates were stacked on either end, and she knew she couldn't lift it. She was exhausted. Day after brutal day, she trained. For nothing. She wasn't getting smaller. Her limbs were heavy. Her joints ached and cracked when she moved. She didn't have anything left to give, but he still wanted more. His hand darted out and pinched her hard on her squishy behind. She let out a startled squeak, which immediately shocked and mortified her. He just stared at her, expressionless, but his eyes were daggers. Other clients were watching her. Their trainers were watching. Maggie could feel their smug, amused stares. Her cheeks burned. Thor raised his toned, tattooed arm and pointed again. "You're gonna get it. Better start lifting." She shuffled her tired bones to the rack and positioned herself under the bar. She sighed as the weight settled upon her shoulders. Thor snapped his head around and caught the others staring. They jumped back into action. The trainers yelled louder and piled on the weights. Clients groaned and whimpered as they struggled to lift. Thor turned his attention back to Maggie. He spoke in monosyllables and grunts, commanding her to push her body beyond its limits. It went on for hours. When she collapsed on the floor from exhaustion, he put a 45-pound plate on her back and made her do push-ups. She forgot everything. She forgot Tessa and the blood. She forgot the sickening crack of her hand making contact with Tessa's jaw. Even the throbbing pain in her wrist was forgotten. She was beyond thinking. Everything hurt too much. Finally, as she lay on the floor in a quivering ball, he tossed a towel at her and told her to take a shower. She sat up slowly and tried to fight the blackness that was creeping in around the edges of her vision. She didn't want to pass out. Thor knelt beside her and put his face close to hers. "You made a big mistake, Maggie. Tessa was a kitten, and you're mine now." His smile was worse than his usual scowl, and Maggie knew she was going to die. His sharp, icy eyes were the last things she saw as the darkness closed in completely. Thor stood up and examined his work. The gym was empty. Daily quotas were filed, and everyone was home preparing their evening meals. Soon the whole city would be asleep. Thor looked at Maggie once more before turning out the lights. He shook his head and left her in the darkness. A small shadow of a smile creased his stern face as he locked the doors and popped in his earbuds. Thunderous guitars and crashing drums filled his ears as he began his long run home. Chapter 5. Thor liked to run. Everything was better when he was running. Screaming guitars and incessant drums were the only things that could drown out his thoughts. Everything was fine in the daytime. When he was training a client, pain was his only focus. No thinking, just sweat and progress. He knew he had done his job well when they screamed and crumpled into a sweaty, writhing ball. Mr. Pratt would be pleased, and that was Thor's main objective. It was the goal of every trainer. Benjamin Pratt had saved them all, and they owed him their lives. At night, when the job was done, things went bad. His mind filled with dark clouds and screams. There were no clear thoughts, no discernible memories. But he knew those screams. Their sounds sent pain shooting through his head like a bolt of lightning. The first time it happened, he collapsed in his apartment. He was screaming and tearing at the short, dark bristles of his hair. One by one, he ripped them from his scalp, and little rivulets of blood ran down his face. Mr. Pratt found him. Mr. Pratt saved him. His hand reached into the pocket of his pristine white suit and removed a syringe filled with an iridescent green goo. Thor had tried to fight him. Darkness enveloped him, and the screaming wouldn't stop. He wasn't certain whose voice it was now. It couldn't be his own. It was too high and mad to be his. He couldn't see anything, just the glowing green that looked like death dressed as a party favor. Mr. Pratt put down the syringe and wrestled Thor onto the bed. There were others in the room. Thor couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. He felt their hands holding him down, and he fought harder. Heavy leather straps were pulled tight across his chest. Every bed was equipped with them. Thor had been the one to pull them tight against many writhing bodies. He fought harder against the tightening straps. He was trapped. Mr. Pratt stood beside the bed and held the needle aloft. Thor let out one last piercing scream before his voice cracked and gave out completely. There was still only darkness and the glowing green. He saw it rise, and Mr. Pratt brought it down and plunged it deep into Thor's left thigh. Instant relief followed. The green light filled him, and warmth flowed through his body. The screaming stopped. The darkness was no more. He slipped away into a deep and peaceful sleep and woke refreshed the next morning. Thor stepped into his apartment and removed his earbuds. The shimmer started almost immediately. He sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time and snatched up the small metal box that sat beside his bed. The pre-filled syringes lay inside on a bed of black velvet. He plunged one deep into his pectoral muscle. A cool, liquid feeling flowed through his body. His muscles relaxed. His heartbeat slowed. The shimmer dissipated, and he sighed. As his eyelids began to droop, he staggered clumsily to the bed and sat down heavily. His body seemed to weigh a ton, like the fatties he saw every day at the SuperGym. He slowly removed his sneakers. His fingers fumbled with the laces as his hands seemed to swell and grow fat. The room began to swing violently from side to side, and he fell back. His head missed the thin, flat pillow, but Thor was already fast asleep. Someone was pounding on the door. Thor woke slowly. He felt his consciousness swimming up from a dark and very deep place. He raised a hand and massaged his face. The hand was back to its normal size, and he squeezed his forehead between his thumb and forefinger. There was a dull, thudding sensation at his temples, but no pain, no shimmer. Thor sat up and listened. Nothing. Just the wind in the trees. He waited. He was about to lay down when the knocking started again. It was strangely rhythmic and relentless. He sighed and slowly swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. He stretched his muscular body, and tiny sparks of light danced in front of his eyes. Not the shimmer, but close. He plodded down the stairs. The metal was cold beneath his bare feet. In the stark white glare of the security lights, he saw Maggie. She was beating on the door steadily, one fist and then the other. Her hair and clothes were completely soaked in blood. Her wide eyes stared out of the gore, and they were black. When she saw him through the window, she stopped knocking. Her skin slid away to reveal a white, grinning skull. She opened her ghastly mouth to scream, and a snake as black as her eyes slithered out. Thor woke up covered in a cold sweat. His heart raced, and he gripped the sheet tightly in his fists. A dream. It was just a dream. The sky was beginning to turn from deep midnight blue to the lighter shade of dawn. The sun was coming, and daytime was safe. He was safe. Thor padded into the bathroom and stood for a long time in front of the mirror. He considered his muscles and noted the ones that needed extra attention. He pinched the flesh at his abdomen and shook his head. Not quite perfect. Never perfect. He showered, pounded a protein shake, and popped in his earbuds. The lingering unease of his dream was gone with the crash of a cymbal. He stepped outside and started to run. He would have to hustle. He was taking the longer route to the SuperGym. He couldn't let his carefully sculpted abs vanish under a layer of flab. It was a constant battle, one he could not lose. He was Thor, a trainer, an ideal. He was close to perfection. Chapter 6. Maggie woke with a screaming headache. Her face was gritty with a fine crust of salt. Every muscle ached. She sat up slowly and took in the room. The last thing she remembered was Thor's killer workout, but this wasn't the first time she'd woken up in a different place. It wasn't her apartment, but it could have been. Most of the apartments in Famecili were renovated when Benjamin Pratt took over. The walls were painted a stark white. The appliances were all shiny, polished steel. The curve of the refrigerator was designed to reflect in a way that made the person look as fat as possible. It was meant to prevent overeating, and it worked surprisingly well. Maggie only ate food that came in boxes and cans. She tried to avoid the refrigerator, but Monica made it almost impossible. That was why she was there. She would hold Maggie in front of the fridge. For such a tall, willowy creature, Monica was surprisingly strong. She listed Maggie's flaws, and the cold steel magnified them. Maggie tried to struggle out of her iron grip, but Monica was relentless. Those nights always ended in tears, and Maggie hated crying. Mr. Pratt chose Monica to be Maggie's roommate. She was in training to join the food labs, and she was a loyal member of the SuperGym. She followed Mr. Pratt's rules, and she didn't hesitate to report Maggie's transgressions. She cooked meals that were both healthy and foul. Maggie gagged as she was forced to eat them, but she ate every bite. She had tried to refuse once before. Monica strapped her to the bed and forced the food down her throat. Nutrition was very important to Monica. There wasn't a lot of food involved in her newest plan. Maggie tried to follow the rules. She ate everything on her diet. It smelled swampy and made her feel woozy and ravenous. It was just enough food to ignite her metabolism, and she was always painfully hungry. The first month was a success. She dropped weight quickly. It was easy. Her body was devouring itself. It hurt. The worst of it happened at night when nagging hunger pains kept her awake and breakfast was far away. Thoughts of food would consume her. She couldn't sleep, and she began walking at night. It was the first rule she broke. She left the apartment after curfew and walked the empty streets. She saw a few goons, but they were easily avoided. Very few clients dared to break Mr. Pratt's rules, and the body-breaking workouts ensured they would all sleep deeply at night. The goons weren't looking for rule breakers. They had grown lazy after years of compliance. She slipped by unseen. She could control her hunger pains as long as she kept moving. If she stopped walking, they came back stronger than ever. The pain was nauseating. Maggie wasn't sure how long she could keep it up. After 4 nights of constant movement, she'd met Finn. He was older than her. At least, she thought he was. It was hard to tell through the fleshy folds around his face. His body was soft and round. He reminded Maggie of the man, the one she had dismembered. Finn's skin was pale to the point of being translucent, and his face was covered in white blonde stubble. His head was hairless and gleamed. She had almost screamed when he stepped out of the shadows. He was used to this response, and his pudgy hand clamped down over her mouth with surprising speed. "I'm a friend," he whispered. His breath smelled faintly of chocolate. "Follow me." She followed. She hadn't smelled chocolate in years. He led her through a bewildering maze of alleys and tunnels that ended outside an old apartment building on the southern side of the city. The buildings were crumbling and broken. Some of the first uprisings occurred in that part of Famecili. The buildings were abandoned when Mr. Pratt bombed that faction out of existence. Finn slipped through a large hole in the wall of one decrepit building. She heard his labored steps climbing the ancient rusting stairs. Maggie stared at the building. She couldn't move. She stood frozen in the street. One step inside would change everything, and she was afraid. She poked her head through the opening. It was dark, but the moon shone through the jagged holes that covered the walls. To her right, the light glittered on the surface of an inky black pool. The smell was overwhelming. "Better come up. It can be a little hard to breathe down there." He was watching her from a rickety spiral staircase. He pressed his massive gut against the crumbling metal railing. Maggie heard the metal creak and bits of rust flaked away. He lumbered up the final steps and out of view. Something skittered through the shadows. There was a muffled plop, and the black pool released 2 slow ripples. The moonlight danced. Maggie ran for the stairs and carefully picked her way around the holes that grew bigger with each step. At the top of the stairs was a large open room. It was too dark to see, and she felt her way along the gritty wall. Her hurried footsteps echoed. Something brushed against her leg, and she screamed. A square of yellow light appeared. Finn stepped into the doorway, and his bulk blocked most of it. "No talking in the cupboard." "What?" He silenced her with a wave of his hand. "Get in here, girl." She followed him into a dimly lit room. Small clusters of people were gathered in the flickering shadows. Their bodies were different shapes and sizes, but they all wore the same vacant expression of bliss on their crumb-covered faces. Drool and a dark liquid that looked like ink ran down their chins. They lay perfectly still. Their wide eyes stared out at something Maggie couldn't see. The room was filled with the soft, labored breathing of the grotesquely large bodies littering the floor. Maggie stared in amazement. One man was big. Bigger than big. He was a mountain of flesh. He looked like the man. One of the first Health at Any Size members. Back before Benjamin Pratt had complete control. When people could still choose to be a monster. She shuddered at the sight of the man's ample flesh and hurried after Finn. He was slipping through a door she hadn't noticed before. It was hidden in the shadows. The pile of bodies was thicker near the door. She had to step over several of them to reach the doorway. Their eyes remained wide and unblinking. They stared right through her. The door was warped and rotting. It didn't fit the frame. She gave it a gentle push. It stuck for a moment and then opened with a loud creak. Finn was seated on a cushion near a gaping hole in the wall. Its fabric was worn to a spotty pale green and coated in a fine layer of mold and rat droppings. A worn black backpack sat by his feet. He didn't look at her. Maggie waited. A long moment passed. Finally, Finn turned to her. "Here," he said as he handed her the dusty bag. "My gift to you." It was filled with treats. Junkies. The clear plastic wrappers crinkled, and she started salivating. Junkies were a popular brand of snack foods when Maggie was a kid. Her father loved them and would sneak them into her lunch. The sweet treats had been a special secret between them. Her mother would have been furious if she'd known. She didn't approve of sweets, not even fruit. Benjamin Pratt banned Junkies. It was the first law he passed after he was elected. The SuperGyms followed immediately. He was improving the health of the city, and everyone loved him. Things had escalated from there. The Junkies were divine. She was hooked with the very first bite. The taste of the chocolate was luxurious, and for a moment she stopped breathing. Blood surged in her veins, her heart raced. Everything was in perfect focus. She took a deep breath and let it out. She shouldered the bag and turned to go. First time's free. Finn's voice was icy. Maggie turned back to him swiftly and found his face transformed. The soft jolliness was gone. His eyes were small and black. After this one, you pay. He didn't say anything more, and Maggie left in a hurry. That was the beginning of it. Chapter 7. This wasn't her apartment. It looked similar, but something was different. She couldn't place it. There's no kitchen. Other Maggie was right. She inspected the room again. This time she saw every detail. It was the same as her apartment except for the empty corner by the window. The gleaming white countertops were there. The metal table and chair were there. Only the stove and refrigerator were missing. This can't be good. Get out of here. Now. Maggie managed to crawl off the bed. Her legs were stiff and sore. A small, involuntary sound escaped her lips when she tried to stand. She teetered for a moment, unsure if her legs would hold her weight. They did. She hobbled to the table holding her swollen hand. There was a small metal box on the chair. It was heavy. She could barely lift it with her good hand. Something rattled inside. There was a shuffling sound outside the door, and Maggie froze. Why didn't you try the door? She looked around frantically for a place to hide, but all the apartments had the same open studio design. It was just a big, empty box. No use trying to hide. The woman that came through the door was shorter than Maggie and squat, with sturdy legs and a thick waist. The front of her uniform was stretched across her ample chest, and she wore her red hair pulled into 2 tight pigtails. They made her look desperately old. Her eyes were hopeless and without compassion. She looked muscular and strong, but Maggie guessed that she must have a fat rating of at least 5. Well, I assume you have questions. Let's get down to it. I don't have a lot of time. She slapped the notebook down on the table and pushed past Maggie. She daintily lowered her mighty rear into the only chair and gave Maggie a challenging look. Well, questions. Only one. Where's Mr. Pratt? Pigtails couldn't hide her surprise. I know he's here. She paused and looked around. Wherever here is. Bring him to me. I want to speak to him. She couldn't keep the tremor out of her voice. Pigtails heard it and grinned. I'll go get him. I'm sure he's got something special planned for you. She pressed her massive tits against the table and hefted her body out of the chair. She capped her pen and closed her notebook with exaggerated slowness. There was a small, knowing smile on her lips. Maggie wanted to slap it off her face. Pigtails gave her a wink and used her gigantic rear to push open the door. Being Benjamin Pratt's special project was exhausting. Maggie never got used to the kidnappings. They were happening more and more regularly, and every time she woke up in a terrified sweat. Panic consumed her in those first few minutes. Then the realization of what had happened was worse than the panic, because she knew what came next. Maggie seated herself on the countertop. She leaned back on her elbows and waited for his arrival. The light above the door flashed purple. It was almost always purple. Occasionally, the light was blue. Blue was worse. The door swung open. Mr. Pratt was dressed in his customary all-white ensemble. It was the same bright shade as the walls, making his tan face seem to hover in the air. He smiled at her, but his dark eyes were angry. He dismissed Pigtails with a quick wave of his hand. She left in a huff with one last hard look at Maggie. She slammed the door behind her and locked it. Mr. Pratt laughed, and Maggie felt her blood turn to ice. He leaned against the counter and placed his hand on her knee. "You've been causing me a lot of problems, my dear girl. You know I don't like problems." His hand moved up her thigh and his grip tightened. She bit her lip and refused to cry out. She wouldn't let him win. He laughed again and squeezed harder. Maggie tasted blood. "Tessa was one of my first trainers. Did you know that? She and Thor have been with me since the beginning. She was never as good as he was, but she was so enthusiastic. And now she's dead. Because of you." He moved his hand farther up her leg and squeezed harder. Tears filled Maggie's eyes. He wrapped her hair around his other hand and pulled her closer. She cried out, "I want to know how you did it. You can barely curl a 10-pound dumbbell, but somehow you had the strength to crush her skull. How?" Maggie felt sick. It had happened again. And it's going to keep happening. Mr. Pratt was waiting. His hand went higher. "No." Her voice was high and reedy. She barely recognized it as her own. She was somewhere up high, floating above her own body. "Tell me how you did it." "I don't know." Her damn voice would not stop shaking. "Bullshit." He whispered it in her ear like a lover. Then he yanked her head back and undid his pants. He shoved himself inside her. She cried, but less than the time before. This time he didn't slam her head into the wall. "Just play along." "Tell me." He repeated it with every thrust, but Maggie barely heard him. She was still floating above it all. She watched her hand draw back. It was going to happen again. She was going to do it this time. No. And then she was back in her body. Mr. Pratt was done. He buttoned his pants and ran a hand over his short bristles. He turned away, and she saw those gruesome extra eyes. "Do you know where you are?" "Hell?" He laughed again. Maggie wished she'd kept her mouth shut. His eyes, the real ones, were wild. No point in provoking him. Not yet. "Oh, this place is much worse." He laughed again and for far too long. Maggie felt a cramp in her belly. He leaned in close and stroked her hair. "Don't forget about Fat Camp, Maggie. I know you've heard the rumors." Of course she had. Everyone knew about the death camp. "Please." Mr. Pratt found the high, squeaky pitch of her voice hilarious. She'd never heard him laugh this much. Not since the final purge. Mr. Pratt wasn't known for his sense of humor, and his laughter was terrifying. "Not yet, my dear. You get another chance. What a lucky, lucky girl you are. You're safe. For now." Who spoke for me? It had to be Thor. He had been waiting to torture her for years. Each failed trainer was a step closer. He wouldn't want her dead. It was finally his turn. Mr. Pratt ran a hand over his face. His cheeks were red from his mirth, but the laughter had passed. The anger had returned to the dark pits of his eyes. Tessa, you see, you didn't kill her immediately. She died slowly. It was agony for her. Very painful to watch. He wasn't looking at her. His expression was distant and sad. He shook his head slowly. The girl had a good heart. It's a stupid thing to have, but she couldn't help it. I made a promise to fulfill her dying wish. She had a new plan for you, Maggie. She believed she had finally discovered how to cure you. He pinched the hanging flesh under her arm and made a face. She made me promise I would allow you to live. She so wanted to help you. Stupid girl. Maggie thought she saw tears in his eyes, but she was wrong. His big hand closed around her throat. The lights danced. Everything started to go black, and Maggie fought to stay conscious. I don't know what you are, but I will figure you out, my dear. You have 1 month. Follow Tessa's program and lose as much as you can. If it's not enough, fat camp is your future. He dropped her on the floor and kicked her in the ribs. She gasped and choked, but managed to roll away from the second kick. Her throat burned and her eyes hurt. Mr. Pratt stepped over her as he walked out the door. He didn't give her a second look. Maggie heard voices in the hall. Pigtails entered a moment later. Her face was grim. Are you ready to be serious now? Maggie nodded and gingerly touched her throat. Good. Do you have any questions? Yes. It hurt to talk. Pigtails sighed and rolled her eyes. This is going to take too long. Here. She held out her hand to Maggie. On her rough, calloused palm was a small green pill. What is... It will take the pain away. For now. They last about 20 minutes. Just what we need. Take it. Take the pill. What could be worse than this? She took the pill. It stuck in her throat. Tears rolled down her cheeks as a fresh wave of pain exploded behind her eyes. It took several attempts to get it down. Each one was more painful than the last. Pigtails waited patiently. This was obviously not the first time she'd done this. Maggie's throat felt better almost immediately. Her head was foggy. She couldn't hold on to a thought for long. The whole room seemed to be spinning, but she didn't hurt anymore. Well, questions. The room swooped and dipped. Pigtails was a blur. Where am I? Her throat felt thick. It was a struggle to form the words. The clinic. No. The clinic was a block of buildings on the outskirts of Famecili. A high steel wall surrounded them, and only the tallest buildings were visible. The windows that could be seen were covered with iron bars. No one really knew what went on there. There was an armed goon patrolling the only entrance at all times. Very few people had the clearance to enter. Even the trainers were left outside when they brought their problem clients. Clients went in, and they came out altered. Quiet. They couldn't remember what had happened in the clinic. At least, that's what they claimed. Their eyes said different. There were rumors. Experiments with new weight loss drugs. Problem clients made perfect test subjects. Maggie regretted the willingness with which she had swallowed the green pill. Anything else? Pigtails was drumming her stubby fingers on the table. Where is my calorie tracker? You don't need one here. Your diet is carefully monitored and prepared for you. You won't have to worry about your junkie addiction. No way to get them in here. You know? Of course. You think you're smart? Mr. Pratt has seen it all. Many that were far more cunning than you. I can't believe he's wasting his time on a junkies addict. Addicts that enter the clinic don't usually get to leave. What makes you so special? I thought I was supposed to ask the questions. Pigtails glared at her. Her face was bright red. Her hands curled around the edge of the table, and she spoke through gritted teeth. Anything else? How could you let him do it? Pigtails was unmoved. It wasn't the first time, was it? You should feel lucky he chose you. Some of us would jump at the chance. Some of us can appreciate his genius. His madness, not genius. He's a madman. It happened fast. The table flipped and Pigtails was on top of her. She hit Maggie in the face. Her thick fists made contact over and over. Maggie tried to hold on to consciousness. She was on the verge of passing out, but the attack continued. She couldn't stand it anymore. It hurt too much. She tasted blood and her eyes were swollen to painful slits. A skinny man in a white lab coat appeared. He was surprisingly strong and pulled Pigtails off Maggie with little effort. Pigtails was exhausted and went willingly. She hadn't known how to stop once she got started. Luckily for her, Maggie had more control. She wasn't worth it. The skinny man extended his hand to her. His fingers were long and thin. His pale skin glowed under the bright fluorescent lights. She took his hand hesitantly, and he helped her to her feet. He shook her hand awkwardly. His fingers were damp and limp. He pushed his glasses up on his nose and smiled shyly. It gave his face a boyish look. Hello, Maggie. I'm Dr. Clyde. I'll be monitoring your weight loss effort from now on. He grinned wider and held up a small tablet. The screen glowed purple and green. It was labeled Plan 210MJQ. I worked closely with Tessa to create your new plan. It's very precise. Some of my finest work. Tessa really believed this one was it. She was convinced you would surprise everyone. Maggie fell ill. It had happened again. Why Tessa? Why not Mr. Pratt? Not yet. Save the big boss for last. Dr. Clyde tapped on the tablet and peered at his notes. From his pocket, he produced a blue plastic tube. Dinner time. This is dinner. The pill inside the tube was turquoise and the size and shape of a large marble. Her throat was still throbbing. Fighting with Pigtails had made things worse. Everything hurt. Even the tips of her fingers ached. Down the hatch. I am sorry, but you have to do it in front of me. He smiled apologetically and shrugged. He really did seem sorry. Maggie trusted him the least of all. It's only for a month. If you react the way Tessa expected, you'll soon be placed on phase 2. Real food. There you go. Choke it down. I am sorry I can't give you any water. They can be a little hard to swallow. It hurt all the way down to her belly. It expanded and warmed her insides, and she felt immediately full and sleepy. You should get into bed now. The pills kick in rather quickly. Her eyelids were already drooping. He put his arm around her and helped her to the bed. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. Dr. Clyde ran his hand down her body. The smile he now wore changed him. The youthful sweetness was gone. This smile was void of feeling and hardened his features into a cold, calculated mask. He made another note on his tablet, and a yellow light appeared above the door. He pushed his glasses up on his nose and smiled. He whistled as he straightened the table and chair. He took a rag from his pocket and cleaned up the blood. When the room was spotless, he typed something on his tablet, and the lights went out. Only the yellow light blazed above the doorway. He finished his song with a flourish and left the apartment, and the door softly clicked shut behind him. Chapter 8. Maggie didn't know where she was. Another room in the clinic? It was dark, but there was a bluish light coming from what looked to be a large vending machine at the end of the hall. But that was impossible. Vending machines were outlawed along with junkies. They had all been destroyed or repurposed into racks for the dumbbells. Someone was standing in front of the machine. They stopped and took something out of the door at the bottom. A cylinder. A can of some kind. There was another person leaning against the side of the machine, but they were hidden in shadow. The person in front of the machine snapped open the can and turned her face to the light. It was Monica. It had to be. Maggie would know that pinched face anywhere. Monica said something and laughed. Maggie was startled by the sound. Monica never laughed. Laughter was not acceptable under Mr. Pratt's rule, and Monica was an obedient client. The girl took a long drink from the can and burped loudly. It couldn't be Monica, but it looked exactly like her. Maggie crept a little closer. The blue light hurt her eyes in the darkness. She ducked behind a column as Monica turned toward her. She could just make out what she was saying. It's weird, right? The whole concept is ahead of its time. The programs are finally up and running smoothly. No more glitches. Her companion replied, but Maggie couldn't hear what was said. She saw Monica smile. Do you think they know what's going on? The hosts, I mean. Do you think they have any idea? Another muffled reply. The person in the shadows shifted, and Maggie saw a slim brown arm reach out and take the can from Monica. I'm glad I was chosen for the storyboard. Can you imagine? Laying around all day? I'd go crazy. Maggie inched closer and hid behind another column. She could hear the other voice now. It was very faint and familiar. They don't know what's going on. That's what the medication is for. You know what I mean. I'm just glad I don't have to be involved. I love my part. It's so gruesome. I wish they had made me less of a bitch. Monica pushed a loose strand of hair out of her eyes. Maggie noticed she wasn't wearing her SuperGym uniform. What would be the fun in that? Monica's friend crumpled the can and tossed it into an unseen trash can. The metallic thud echoed off the walls. Come on, I want to watch Jeremy play. He's so sexy. If you're into that kind of thing. They walked quickly away from where Maggie was hiding. Monica's long-legged stride was unmistakable, but Maggie was watching the other girl. There was something familiar about her bouncing black ponytail. An alarm was blaring. Maggie's eyes snapped open. She tried to turn off the alarm but found she could not move. The noise went on for some time. The abrasive sound tore through her head. She could barely think. All she knew was that she was paralyzed. That's what you get for being a stupid idiot, she thought. That's redundant. Shut up, other Maggie. She was convinced that she was losing her mind. She'd been able to hide it for some time, but it was happening more often now. There had always been other voices, even when she was little. She assumed this happened to everyone. The voices never stayed long, or they melted into another voice. Her voice. Then things had changed. One voice had distinguished itself from the din. It had become a defined personality and was no longer a part of herself. This voice liked to give advice. It liked to pass judgment. It never agreed with her. She'd started calling it Other Maggie, and it was growing stronger by the day. Time passed. There was no way to know if it was seconds or hours. The blare of the alarm was incessant. Maggie could see it sawing away at her sanity. She felt like she was very close to some kind of limit. Her mind was on a precipice, and it was becoming more and more difficult to balance. Slowly, she became aware of a tingling in her limbs. She wiggled her toes. It sent an electric shock through her body, but she didn't cry out. Tiny pinpricks of heat entered her muscles. It burned. The pain was almost too much. The light above the door turned red and flashed rapidly. Dr. Clyde entered. He touched the wall, and the alarm fell silent. His eyes were bright with excitement behind his glasses. He grinned as he leaned over her bed. Maggie didn't like it. He looked like a mischievous little boy. "Did you try to move? It can be quite electrifying." He waited. His smile faded a little, and he tapped his tablet. "I'll assume you did. Don't worry. It wears off after a while. The first dose is always the worst. You've been denying your body nutrients for a very long time. It takes a while to remember what healthy feels like." He adjusted his glasses and looked at his notes. "While we wait, I'll take your morning weight. The bed acts as a giant scale. Helps us stay on schedule when the pill lasts longer than expected. It does make the bed rather uncomfortable. I am sorry about that." He punched in several codes and watched the screen. Maggie could see the numbers reflected in his glasses. 196. Had she really gained that much? No wonder Mr. Pratt smacked Tessa around. Even Maggie was shocked by the number. "That's piggish. Maybe you should have listened to Tessa while she was still alive." Maggie ignored the voice. Dr. Clyde looked grim. No boyish smile now. "Move your arms." She hesitated. Dr. Clyde sighed impatiently. "Come on. It will have worn off by now. It won't hurt." Maggie lifted her arms slightly. It felt heavy, but it moved. She slowly lifted herself until she was sitting on the edge of the bed. Dr. Clyde sat at the table and regarded her over the rims of his glasses. "I'm afraid you have not made any progress." "It's the first day." "The first pill usually works rather quickly. I am hopeful we will see a major loss at the lunchtime weighing." "How often am I weighed?" 3 times a day, 4 on the weekends." "And you expect a loss at each?" "That is what Tessa predicted. I think it's a bit lofty, but she was always the favorite around here." "She worked here?" "Off and on." He looked annoyed. "She didn't have the proper education in food sciences." "I thought she was just a trainer." "She was. And then you started causing problems. Nothing we tried worked on you. She was brought in to lead the team in a new direction. No one knew how to deal with such a stubborn client. Your file is quite extensive. No other client has tried and failed for this long." "So you're torturer number 1 now that she's gone. That's why I'm here?" "I am Mr. Pratt's chief dietitian. I was assigned to your case because I worked closely with Tessa on your health plan." "It's really your plan, isn't it?" "I am afraid that's not possible. Only trainers can make plans for clients, and I have not been promoted." He would never be promoted. He was too thin. Most clients had the same gaunt, hollow look, but the trainers were hand-selected by Mr. Pratt for their beauty and muscle tone. They endured a rigorous initiation before being tanned and highlighted to perfection. They were the ideal. They were what everyone else was always striving to become. Dr. Clyde was watching her. Maggie was momentarily afraid he could hear her thoughts. "That's ridiculous. Stop being so stupid." Dr. Clyde adjusted his glasses again and sighed. "This is not a promising beginning, Maggie. We only have a month. We need every single weigh-in to achieve your goal. Play along. Suggest a punishment." I'll do an extra hour in the pool. Better make it the treadmill. He made a note on his tablet. That reminds me. Don't tell Thor about your new diet plan. He's your trainer, but your diet is now being handled exclusively by Mr. Pratt. Do you understand? I won't say a word. That would be easy. Speech was impossible during a Thor workout. Dr. Clyde looked pleased. He snapped his notebook shut with a creepy grin. Good girl. I hate him. I really, really hate him. Play nice. You don't want it to happen again. Not yet. Go on now. We have a bicycle waiting for you downstairs. It's a very scenic ride to the SuperGym, and it's only 12 miles. Great. Maggie noticed the light above the door was yellow again. It switched to green as she passed through. Dr. Clyde made a note and smiled. The corridor was dingy and dimly lit. It was an old building, one of the ones still under renovation. The ancient elevator had not yet been removed, but she knew better than to try it. It wouldn't work, and it would set off a silent alarm. A fit squad would be there almost immediately, and she'd be in trouble again. That would mean extra workouts, and she already had an extra hour of cardio. She stepped out into a dull gray world. The sky was darker than usual. It was going to rain. It always got darker before it rained. That was the only time the sky changed. It was always gray. Maggie could remember days when the sky changed colors. When she was a child, it had been blue. She took the bicycle from the rack. It was the only one, which was strange in Famecili. Everyone had a bike. She wondered if she was the only one staying in the building. A loud clap of thunder shook her from her thoughts and sent her speeding toward the entrance in the wall. The massive iron doors swung open, and she rode through. Thunder rumbled and lightning flashed. The sky opened up. She pulled up her hood and pedaled steadily through the rain. Her clothes were soaked through by the time she reached the SuperGym. The rain continued to pound down, and the patio was filled with water. She sloshed through on weak, shaking legs. The glass doors slid open. A bell rang. Maggie stumbled through and stood dripping just inside. The main room was packed. The sound of feet pounding on treadmills was deafening. Everyone turned to stare at her, but the moment was brief. The trainers immediately snapped at their clients and increased their speeds. She saw Thor coming. He stormed through the gym. Her heart raced at the sight of him. Pain exploded in her chest. He grabbed her arm and squeezed. Hard. You're late. I had to bike from... No excuses. It's pouring rain. That's an excuse. She sighed. His grip slackened, just a little. I'll do an extra hour on the treadmill. In addition to the one from Dr. Clyde. You know about that? Of course I do. I'm your trainer. I know everything about you. Did he really know everything? Was this some kind of test? Maggie hurried to the locker room to change into dry clothes. She had to borrow SuperGym clothes, which were always too tight and made of translucent purple and green spandex. Thor grinned when he saw her. It was scarier than his usual frown. Get over on the mats. You're starting with push-ups. Chapter 9. 5 more. Lower. I said lower. Get your ass down. Maggie wasn't sure why she could squat lower when he yelled at her. She was certain she was on the brink of collapse. Her legs did not feel as if they could go any lower, but they did. She struggled under the barbell. She was almost sitting on her heels, but it still wasn't enough. Thor looked pissed. His face was bright purple and a vein pulsed in his neck. He lowered his sunglasses and revealed his pale eyes. Despite her flushed cheeks and sweat-drenched skin, she shivered under his icy stare. He didn't say anything. She tried to drop lower. He pushed his sunglasses back up on his nose, and she tried to stand. Her legs refused to move. Then slowly, she began to rise. The barbell swung and dipped, and she cursed as she fought to keep it across her shoulders. Thor shook his head. Maggie thought she saw the hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. Then he pointed at the spin bike, and she groaned. Her legs were already limp and spaghetti-like. He snapped and pointed again. "Get moving. I'll be back in a minute." Maggie climbed on the bike and watched him walk away. Thor slammed through the locker room door. He leaned on the sink and tried to breathe. His heart was beating too fast, and his chest felt tight. What the hell is wrong with me? Thor looked in the mirror, and for the first time, he couldn't focus on his muscles. He didn't even want to practice posing. He whipped off his sunglasses and looked into his own eyes. He slapped his face, and then the other side, and again. He shook his head violently. He flexed his biceps and tried to focus. It was no good. She was in his head. He could see every curve. He couldn't forget her big blue eyes. They were dark like sapphires, and he felt naked when she looked at him. It was unnerving. She seemed to look through the bullshit and the posturing and see what was underneath. He wasn't sure he wanted her to see that. There was a lot he didn't want her to know. Why did it have to be Maggie? Of all the women in Famecili, why did it have to be her? She was a problem, a mystery. Even Mr. Pratt had no idea how to handle her. Thor didn't like being her trainer. Well, that wasn't entirely true. He liked to stare at her ass when she did squats. Maggie's perky, round backside was too wide to be considered ideal, but Thor secretly liked women with a little extra junk in the trunk. Thor had never given women much thought, really. If he wanted one, he took one. It was one of the perks of being a trainer. He had no interest in becoming involved with any of them. He'd seen what love did to people. A bachelor's life was simpler and safer. When Thor was 13, his father left. His mother was angry at first. She yelled a lot. She broke all the dishes. Quincy tried to clean up the glass, and she beat him with a rolling pin. He was older than Thor, but he was weak. He cried and let her keep abusing him. Thor couldn't stand to watch him blubber. He loved his mother, but he would have reacted quite differently. Probably why she chose to hit Quincy instead. His dad found a new girlfriend, a much younger one. The girlfriend sat in the row behind Thor in his health class. She was a year older than him. The girl was nothing special even by high school standards, and he was surprised his dad had created so much drama over such a plain girl. She must have had other talents. The plain ones usually did. She was younger and thinner, and that's what bothered his mother the most. She signed up for a weight loss program at the new gym in Famecili, the very first SuperGym. The program worked. His mother grew thin and learned to style her hair. Mr. Pratt took an interest in her and gave her a job as his secretary. Thor joined the SuperGym and packed on a lot of muscle in a short amount of time. He loved lifting. It made sense. It was simple and effective. He liked the way it made him look, and he started spending more time in front of the mirror. One day while he was flexing, another client called his body the ideal. The next morning, Mr. Pratt offered him a job and launched the SuperGym Trainers program. They could never convince Quincy to join. The family fell apart soon after. Thor moved into his own apartment, but he still saw his mother occasionally. They both worked for the SuperGyms, but in different locations. They rarely spoke, which was a relief. Quincy disappeared. Thor thought it was suspicious at the time. Quincy had always been fond of gadgets. He collected the latest technology and was never without a tablet in his hand. Yet he left everything behind. He didn't even pack his clothes. He just vanished. His mother never really got over his dad. She worked for Mr. Pratt for almost a year, but she just grew weaker and weaker until she died of a broken heart. Thor was a successful head trainer by that point. Mr. Pratt liked what he saw. He was young but commanded respect, and no one dared to say no to him. And he was heartless. That was what Mr. Pratt liked most of all. Thor couldn't change now. He couldn't go easy on Maggie just because of a stupid crush. He splashed some water on his face. A light on his belt flashed. 2 long beeps sounded. She was resting. If he gave her any slack, she was sure to defy him every time. She was an impossible client, and he knew she would be the end of him. Thor stormed out of the locker room. He gathered all of his rage and turned it against her. He threw her on the floor. His hand brushed her breast, but he tried not to think about it. His heart was pounding, and his breathing was shallow and labored. He dropped the heavy battle ropes next to her. "Don't you dare stop." Once he was certain that she was putting in an appropriate amount of effort, he sprinted to the locker room and threw up. Chapter 10. Maggie's heart was pounding. It was going to explode. This time it was actually going to happen. Her arms burned. They were so heavy, and she could barely twitch the ropes. She'd slowed down quite a bit when Thor ran off, but she didn't dare to stop. He had known. How had he known? She kept moving. The burn in her arms was almost unbearable. Sweat dripped from her nose and splashed onto the floor. She was making a nice little puddle. Thor would be pleased. The locker room door banged open. Thor never used doors like a normal person. He took out his anger on them in a way that was terrifying. She could hear him coming across the gym and picked up the pace. His face didn't look right. He was as pale as his rugged tan would allow, and he looked ill. She hesitated. He wobbled slightly on his feet and reached out to steady himself on a nearby squat rack. "Are you okay?" Maggie bit her lip. She shouldn't have spoken, and she was in for it now. He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were hidden behind his ever-present sunglasses, and she couldn't read his expression. "I'm fine. Don't worry about it. Grab a drink and go to the wall. Climbing time." She hated climbing. Her arms hung at her sides like limp noodles. Thor watched her getting into her gear. He took a deep breath and joined her at the wall. Mr. Pratt had entered the building, and Thor knew he was watching. He held his breath and gave Maggie's ample ass a pinch. She jumped and glared at him. He could hear Mr. Pratt laughing. "Get moving." Mr. Pratt threw an arm around Thor's shoulders, and they watched Maggie's ass jiggle as she fought to climb the wall. "Nice work, my boy. A long way to go, but it's a start." He slapped Thor on the back and moved on to the next trainer. Thor tugged on the ropes and pulled Maggie off the wall. She spun around and crashed into him on her way down. He held on to her for a long moment. Her body was rigid in his grip, but she was so soft. He could feel Mr. Pratt's eyes on them, and he quickly dropped her. "Do it again. Faster this time." She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at him. He stared back, doing his best to look mean, until she sighed, dropped her arms, and obeyed. Her bike was on the ground. She just stared at it. It seemed so far away. Thor's workout had lasted all day. Her legs were stone. They wouldn't bend. She didn't think she would ever be able to pick up her bike. Thor was standing beside her. She hadn't noticed. "Need a hand?" "I can't bend my legs." "I'll take that as a compliment." He scooped up the bike with one hand. "Better get moving. Dinner's in 46 minutes. Don't skimp on sleep tonight. Your muscles need it to recover." She watched him run off. Thor was a tyrant and brought her to her breaking point daily, but he was beautiful. Her workouts were more difficult every day, but he was surprisingly nice to her as long as she did what he said. She wanted to hate him, but she couldn't help the fluttery feeling she got when he looked at her with his ice blue eyes. Maggie pedaled toward her new home. It was a long ride. Her legs were screaming before she was over the first hill, and it was getting late. The roads were almost empty. She wasn't going to get there by dinner time. There would be a punishment for missing dinner, and another if she missed curfew. Maggie was exhausted. Her legs were numb. It felt like they weren't even there. Invisible legs, ha! Let's disappear completely. Invisible Maggie. Shut up, other Maggie. You're not going to make it. Get out while you can. You don't want to go back there. She stopped at the top of the last hill. She should turn right toward the clinic compound. Curfew was minutes away, but she hesitated. What kind of life did they have planned for her now? She had seen the few clients who had survived the clinic. They walked with shuffling steps. Their glassy eyes were trained on the ground, and little bubbles of spit collected in the corners of their mouths. Their lives were agony. Her life would be nothing but misery and pain. Maggie could see the wall in the distance. She turned her bike left instead. The road on the left sloped away from the city. She lifted her feet and coasted down a steep hill. The skyline disappeared, and the neat black road started to crack and crumble. Soon it was replaced by a narrow dirt trail that cut a winding path through rolling fields of flowers. The brownish hills were covered with rows of red, yellow, and orange. Maggie wondered if she was hallucinating. She had never seen such vibrant colors in nature. You need to eat. Refuel. For once, she agreed with other Maggie. She had been allowed a quick snack break around lunchtime. Thor gave her a thin bar. Benjamin Pratt had just released 4 new flavors. Hers was grape. It was gross, but it was better than nothing. She gobbled it down in seconds. It was all she had eaten that day. Maggie never questioned what lay beyond the city limits. Even before Mr. Pratt came to power, Famecili had been a singular location. There was nothing else. The vibrant colors of the field were shocking after the undisturbed gray of the city. The brown road rolled on through the gentle hills of flowers and bright green grass. She rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. A monumental wall of steel loomed before her. It stretched out of sight in either direction. The wall around the clinic seemed small and flimsy in comparison. There were ominous black guard towers every few yards. The road took a winding, haphazard route toward the solitary door in the base of the nearest guard tower. Maggie saw a flash of neon. Someone was in the tower. The door swung open with a shriek of rusted metal. Without waiting to see who emerged, Maggie dropped to the ground. Her leg twisted painfully beneath her. Play along. Play dead. She closed her eyes and held very still. Panic welled up inside her. Her heart raced and she fought to control her breathing. Heavy footsteps were rapidly approaching. What happened to her? Passed out. I've seen this a few times before. Not many make it this far. This one must be a fighter. We'll have to tell Mr. Pratt. He doesn't have time for this. Drop her off at the Black Tower. Let Thor deal with her. What a waste. She's pretty. She's fat. Yeah, of course. I just meant that she could be pretty. Someday. Not right now, obviously. You like fatties? I'd be real careful if I were you. Don't let that get around. You never know who will report you. Are you going to report me? Maybe. It would teach you a lesson. Don't do that to me, Dunk. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Help me put her on the cart. She heard them move away, and Maggie dared to crack open an eye. There were 3 of them. The 2 who had been talking were average-looking. They had thin, pale faces and tiny waists, hidden by baggy purple and green uniforms. The 3rd man was big, bigger than anyone she'd ever seen. He towered over the others. His uniform stretched tight across his chest, and his muscles were chiseled marble. He was looking right at her. Their eyes met. "Idiot, close your eyes." His footsteps shook the ground. Each one sent an electric shock through her vertebrae. Maggie struggled to control her shaking muscles as he knelt beside her. She could feel his hot breath on her cheek. He didn't touch her. He didn't say anything. What was he waiting for? Play along. Don't fucking move. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "Open your eyes." He spoke quietly. His voice was deep and rumbled in his throat. She stopped breathing. Every part of her body became perfectly still. "I sent the others inside, and I'm blocking the view from the guard tower. No one can see you. Open your eyes." "Don't you dare." She opened her eyes. He smiled. He had a nice face. "That's better. Name's Trent. You are..." Maggie?"
"Stay very still, Maggie. We only have a few minutes."
"Are you going to kill me?"
He laughed softly. "No, definitely not."
"Are you a trainer?"
"My turn. What are you doing outside the city limits? It's past curfew, you know."
"I don't know how I ended up here. I blacked out."
"And rode a bike for 28 miles.
"It was downhill." "Smart. Real smart."
How about the truth, Maggie?"
"I wanted to disappear." He didn't reply immediately. She couldn't guess what he was thinking. His face was a mask, but she felt strangely hopeful.
"I can't help you with that. In a moment, I need to put you on the cart. I have to bring you back."
"It's okay. I don't have anywhere else to go."
"I have to report you."
"To Mr. Pratt?"
"To Mr. Pratt, yes. I should bring you to him now." He glanced over his shoulder. "There is one other option. I can bring you to Thor. Choose your doom."
"Thor?" Trent was surprised.
"That was quick."
"Anyone is better than Mr. Pratt. Please, don't bring me to him."
"Fine, but Thor is no better. He's not a good guy, Maggie. Don't ever forget that."
"Oh, I don't think I will."
"Time for the cart. I'll try to be gentle, but I can't be too nice."
"I understand. Thank you." He smiled again and scooped her up effortlessly. She was lowered onto the cart next to her bicycle, and Trent pedaled away. Maggie kept her eyes closed, but she knew when they reached the top of the first hill. Trent's breathing grew easier. A cool breeze ruffled her hair. Trent pedaled in silence. The cart bounced all over the road. He turned the bike sharply and brought it to a sudden stop.
"Open your eyes, Maggie."
This road was the worst she'd seen. The hard-packed dirt was full of holes and big rocks. Enormous black trees stood on either side of the broken road. Their mossy branches met overhead in a tangle, forming a kind of archway. Trent cleared his throat. His eyes were locked on the large building that was just visible in the growing dark.
"This is Thor's house. Are you sure this is what you want?"
The house was actually a black stone tower covered with windows. The lower level was lit, and they could see Thor sitting at a plain metal table. He was typing furiously on his tablet, probably concocting some new torture for Maggie. He was not going to love this little disruption. Maggie swallowed nervously. I'm sure.
This is as far as I go. Once you pass the trees, the sensors will identify you. It's already entered in the database. You'll know everything. I'm sorry. I really wish I could do more.
Maggie actually believed him. Chapter 11. Sirens blared. Thor jumped to his feet. He knocked a plate onto the floor and it exploded into thousands of little shards. White needles. Someone was in the yard. It was after curfew. Dinner was over, and everyone should have been preparing to sleep. Thor kicked a piece of plate across the floor. The clients were not allowed outside of the city. His home should have been a safe haven from the whining, crying wretches he saw every day. He went to the console on the wall and typed in a password. Bright lights illuminated the night, and he saw Maggie. Of course it's Maggie. He threw open the door and stormed outside. What are you doing here? I got lost. I was riding home and blacked out. Who brought you here? Thor regretted not checking his messages as soon as the tablet beeped. He'd been wrapped up in planning Maggie's workouts and had dismissed the notification. Maggie had missed curfew. He should have been the first to know. Maggie's face was washed out by the bright lights. The bones of her face cast a shadow that gave her a skeletal look. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her middle, and she was trembling. Trent?
You met Trent.
His chest was tight. The air rushed from his lungs, and he suddenly couldn't breathe. He gripped the doorframe with his thick fingers to keep from swaying. Maggie wasn't looking at him. She stood staring at her feet. I passed out. He was there when I woke up. He said you would already know all of this. Thor looked angry, but he didn't reply. He took her hands and pulled her inside the house. He punched in another code on the console. The door locks clicked, and the lights went out. The world outside was once again plunged into darkness. Thor's home was stark and bare. One chair, one table. A metal spiral staircase led to the second level, which she assumed held his bedroom. A little shiver of excitement went up her spine at the thought. Thor watched her. She was still wearing her neon gym clothes. Her hair was wild and knotted. Her eyes lingered on the stairs, and he wanted to drag her into his bedroom and destroy her. No. He banished the thought instantly. There wasn't time for that. He needed to figure out his plan of attack. He hadn't seen her information, hadn't been prepared for his late-night visitor. The message light was flashing on his tablet. He tapped the screen and skimmed the message. Trent. She met Trent. That was a problem. Thor didn't like Trent. He was dangerous. As Maggie's trainer, it was Thor's duty to keep her safe. Trent had not dared to step onto his property this time. Their last meeting ended with both men in the hospital, and Thor's recovery had been slow. Mr. Pratt's face had been purple with rage. Thor was out of commission for 5 days. Almost an entire week. Anything more than a day was unacceptable. Trainers were the ideal. They were the picture of a healthy life. Being sick was not part of the program. Thor should have been fired, but Mr. Pratt let him stay. He gave Trent a new assignment. Thor received a stern lecture, and the incident was never mentioned again. Now Maggie was here, and he was in trouble again. Thor didn't like trouble. Trainers and clients were not allowed to socialize. Mr. Pratt could never find out. Thor would not get another chance. She was waiting for him to speak. Thor felt strangely uncomfortable and nervous. He'd never been at a loss for words before. When Maggie was around, he couldn't think. His mouth went dry, and his throat closed. What happens now? Her voice was quiet, and she refused to look at him. She was seated on the only chair and had pulled up her knees to her chest. Her legs were dirty, and her tangled brown hair fell over her face. Somehow, she still managed to stir something in Thor. A strange sensation sat heavily in the pit of his stomach. Thor didn't like feelings. They made him feel ill. They made him ill.
You shouldn't be here, but it's too late to bring you home.
You have a curfew too? She lifted her head and her bright eyes met his. Thor's stomach gave another nauseating flip. He moved quickly across the room to lean on the fridge. When he stood close to the shiny metal, his reflection was hidden. He didn't want her to see him at his worst. He waved his hand at her dismissively.
Of course. Adequate sleep is necessary for fat loss.
You're not fat. He smiled.
There is always room for improvement.
Maggie didn't know what to say. Thor was a monster. Cold, heartless torture was his forte. But this Thor was different. His smile was a little sad. He seemed uncertain and possibly insecure. Did he actually think he was fat? Use this against him. How? Other Maggie didn't have an answer. She didn't think she could use it against him. It was too mean. Maggie knew how much it hurt. But who was it that hurt you? Thor. He still hurts you. He has no compassion. This is a game. He's playing you. You need to play him. Thor was sweating just a little along his hairline. His hands were tightly clasped, and his knuckles were white against his deep tan. He looked nervous. Why was he so nervous?
You can sleep upstairs tonight. I'll sleep down here. You don't need to worry. I'm not like Mr. Pratt.
Maggie's cheeks grew hot. She looked away in shame. He knew. Of course he knew. He knows. Everyone knows. He thinks you're disgusting. Always so helpful, other Maggie. She followed Thor up the stairs. His room was sparsely furnished. His bed was a simple metal frame. No mattress. A thin black blanket was folded at the foot of the bed, and a pristine though lumpy pillow sat at the top of it. This is where you sleep.
Yes. Why?
I guess I thought trainers would be treated better.
Some are. I chose to live a simple life. Helps me stay focused. Now get into bed.
He handed her the pillow and covered her with the scratchy blanket. The metal beneath her was cold, and she shivered a little. Thor stood over her a moment longer. He didn't say a word. His rugged face was a mask. His eyes were slightly darker than usual, and his gaze was empty. No emotions. Then he blinked and gave his head a small shake. He turned and bolted down the spiral staircase. The metal rungs shook with his every step. His hand slapped the wall on his way out, and she was alone in the darkness. Maggie sat up and quickly surveyed the room. It was small, about half the size of the downstairs. There was a small window near the ceiling, but it was out of reach. The walls were polished stone. There were a few cracks, but nothing big enough for a foothold. There were no other options. There was a bathroom off of one wall, but it was a tiny windowless cubicle. Why is it so much smaller on the inside? Good question. The tower was massive. It rose high above the tops of the trees surrounding it, and it was wide. There had to be more than just a few bare rooms. Maggie got out of bed and padded quietly across the floor. She went to the far wall and examined it closely. Her nose brushed against the cold stone as she studied every tiny crack in the smooth surface. Hours passed, but Maggie was unaware of the time. The moon was high and full. A shaft of brilliant white light shone through the window and illuminated a small patch of wall. Maggie saw it then. There was a line. More than just a crack. It was too straight, too perfect. It began at a place just above her head and ran straight up to join with another line. This line cut across the wall and joined another. A door. It was a secret door. Maggie pushed on the smooth stone until she heard a soft click. The door swung inward and revealed only darkness. Maggie climbed through the door and found herself on another twisted metal staircase. There was nothing but darkness below. She hesitated. Her heart was pounding in her ears, but she inched her foot slowly forward, searching out the next step. There was no going back now. She descended slowly, step by step down into the complete darkness. She tried not to imagine what waited below. You really don't want to know. Probably not. Maggie paused, and her hands groped the empty blackness. Nothing. She crept carefully down another step, and another. She had to be on the first level by now, but the staircase continued down, down, down. Above her, the door quietly clicked shut. She had not truly been in darkness until that moment. The pale, barely visible light from the bedroom had not provided much, but it had been a focal point. It broke up the monotonous black. Maggie felt lightheaded, and she froze. Her chest grew tight. Her lungs burned as she fought for air. Don't panic. Panic. Maggie shook her head and closed her eyes. The darkness was the same, but she felt better, as if she could open her eyes right now and find herself safe in her old apartment. Maggie knew it wasn't true, but she found it calming anyway. She tried to focus on taking another breath, a slightly bigger breath. She relaxed just a little, and the sweet air rushed in, soothing her burning lungs. Maggie could breathe again. She took one long, shuddering breath after another. Her heart was still pounding in her ears, but the panic was fading. She opened her eyes to the darkness. No, it was still too much. She quickly shut them again. Her paralysis ended, and she was able to slide her foot out, feeling for the next step. But there wasn't one. She took a hesitant step forward and found solid ground. She reached her hand out and took another step. Her fingers brushed up against a wall, and she cried out in surprise. She ran her hands along the rough surface as she moved cautiously forward. Flakes of it crumbled away under her touch. There was a faint dripping sound. It sounded far away. Maggie reached out without letting her fingertips leave the safety of the wall. Her hand touched something wet and slimy. There was another wall to her right, just beyond her reach. There was a strange smell in the tunnel. It wasn't entirely unpleasant. The scent was familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. It grew stronger as she went, and it soon became overpowering. Maggie tried holding her breath. She felt woozy. The darkness seemed to shudder and swing around her. She could hear the dripping more clearly now. It was hard to determine how long she walked. Time had no meaning in the absolute darkness. The corridor stretched on without turning. The walls were cold and wet with a slightly sticky substance. Her hands were coated in it. The smell was getting worse. The air was thick with it. She pinched her nose and took careful, shallow breaths through her mouth. It didn't help much. The walls disappeared abruptly. Maggie felt around blindly. She was in a room, 4 walls and an open doorway. A slight breeze stirred the air. The smell had faded, and Maggie took an indulgent breath of the cool, fresh air. You can see. The faintest glimmer of light filled the cavernous room. A single torch placed high in a corner of the room gave it just enough light to see a door on the far wall. Maggie crossed the room carefully. Her footsteps echoed around her, and her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Could Thor hear her? It was late when she finally found the door, and she had no idea how long she had walked in the darkness. It felt like a long time. Morning was coming. He would discover she was missing, and he would check the tunnel first. Don't wait around for him. Move it. Maggie didn't want to meet Thor in this dark and terrible place. She picked up the pace and ran toward the light. It grew brighter as she ducked through the doorway into a wide passage. The walls oozed with a thick, wet sludge. It was black and congealed like old blood. Chains hung from the walls at intervals around the room. The sludge was thickest around them. Her stomach turned over. Run faster. Her footsteps echoed off the walls and crashed all around her, the sound of hundreds of feet running. The hallway veered to the left, And Maggie passed through a doorway and into another long corridor. The walls were cleaner. No sludge. They were wet and green with moss. The air smelled of trees and dirt. She took a deep breath.